Begins from the starting point where Morton left off, which is that basically there's a problem with our statistics. So I'm not going to discuss that in great detail. But what I wanted to say was that even though we know a lot about the water that we have worldwide, for example, even in a developed country like the United States, they don't have clear maps of the aquifers that are shared between the US and Mexico. So no two sets of maps have the same descriptions of the water underneath. Anyway, so basically let me just introduce one of the terms that I'm going to talk about, and that term is ecospace or environmental utilization space. And the environmental utilization space refers to the idea that we all have a certain amount of land or water or phosphorus, for example, that we have to use on this earth, and it's essentially to be shared between all people. So the idea of the presentation is to communicate the message that there is a sort of a shrinking ecospace, especially if you take into account that we will have a growing population worldwide and that we have incredible new demands on our resources. And that scarcity perhaps leads to certain sorts of governance choices, and perhaps in making those decisions about governance choices, maybe maps can help. Before jumping ahead, a lot of people will think that this is a very neo-Malthusian presentation. Perhaps there's enough water in an asteroid and we could collect that water and bring it to Earth. And this sounds quite ridiculous, but last week I saw on television that Luxembourg is actually planning to go to asteroids to get minerals for the Earth. So it's not so far-fetched, but my assumption is that we are going to manage the Earth based on resources within the Earth. So the key question is, how are we going to share this resource amongst various actors within the country, within the world? Let's talk about land and fresh water. Land is definitely more or less fixed on a global scale, and fresh water goes up and down, but it's on average more or less fixed. So what you basically have is a sort of a stable amount, but your demand keeps increasing everywhere. And so the question is, how are we going to try and deal with this more or less stable water amount? So what we find is that in many parts of the world, people are trying to figure out how to deal with this water issue. The good news, of course, is that even though there is some amount of shortage, you have unlimited ecosystem services if you can actually use these waters carefully. So these services include transferring nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, providing water food, regulating climate and floods, or cultural services. And so that is the good news, but only if you manage the resources carefully. But basically, natural scientists are arguing that we are crossing planetary boundaries, and NGOs are saying that we are using 1.5 times the Earth today. So what does this mean in terms of governance? Now, one school of thought, and I think Vanessa referred to that in her presentation, basically is the neoliberal capitalist school of thought. And they think when you have shortage, price the commodity, use markets, privatize it, sell it. And that brings you into the murky world of private confidential contracts, and when there's a problem, confidential arbitration. So very simply put, you say water is scarce, therefore water should be priced, therefore water becomes a commodity, therefore water can be privatized, and India has gone so far that they've now privatized a river. But in the United States, you also find that aquifers are privately owned, and now when you have fracking, you get dirty water, you can recycle that water, but after a while the water is so dirty that what happens is private companies come in, buy this dirty water, put it into an aquifer and wait for the price to rise. And when the price of the water will rise, then they will clean up this water and try to market it. So this is how the neoliberals are thinking about these resources. And then, of course, you're not just thinking about resources in your own country, but resources abroad. Then the next option is hegemonic power. You say, okay, If the water is in my country, it belongs to me. Egypt has often said, as Sudan has, that because they have an agreement in law saying how much water Egypt should get, therefore Egypt owns the bulk of the water in the Nile. So that's an hegemonic experience of water. And you could also securitize the resource. You could say some countries have phosphorus. We need phosphorus for food production. We are going to make a bilateral agreement with that country for the next 100 years and collect the phosphorus for our needs. And that is also happening at this moment. So you can use nationalization or hegemonic power to acquire resources. A third option is polycentric approaches, which Elinor Ostrom brought up. And basically, it is neither neoliberal nor hegemonic. It's basically that it's neither top-down, not bottom-up. Many areas of self-management, experiences, experimentation to figure out how to solve the crisis. And the last option is the Sustainable Development Goals, which have tried to see whether we can somehow come to some kind of a global agreement on where we want to go. And even though those targets and indicators may be to some extent stupid, may be based on incorrect information, may require a lot of extra effort, they're still trying to beat the system in terms of what the neoliberal capitalists want to do, which is basically get ownership of these resources. So when I come to my maps, I'm going to try and show you some of these issues with the maps. But my personal vision is that we probably need global, sustainable, universal intergovernmentalism, and within that, you could perhaps allow these various approaches to co-function, but within a limited extent. Now, if you look at water, so water is now being governed at the global level, but it's fairly fragmented. But if you go into a temporal and a geographical and a relational scale, what you find is that 5,000 years ago, you had local rules and actors. And they owned the water, or they had rules regarding water governance. And after that, you get provincial rules and actors, you get markets, NGOs, you get national rules, you get regional governance and rules. So what you get anywhere is a layering of rules one over the other. Now in the Netherlands, we are very capable of dealing with these kinds of issues because when we make a new law, we immediately change other laws. But if you go to the continent of Africa, and I'll show you a map subsequently, you'll find that they have layers of rules, one on top of the other. And so what a scanner like this can do is it can tell you what the reality is today, but it cannot tell you how in the past knowledge has led to certain types of relationships, nor can it tell you who owns exactly what is there in that property. You could, of course, perhaps put it in. So when you're talking about governing ecospace or governing the water, you have perhaps at the highest level of abstraction a box where you're talking about how do we share global minerals like phosphorus, metals, nutrients, land, water, ecosystems, or energy, or the electromagnetic spectrum, or even how do we share the right to emit greenhouse gases or plastic into the oceans. So that's at the top level. Now all these resources are then used for things like technologies, virtual technologies, physical technologies, biochemical technologies, but also intellectual and emotional knowledge that is now being put on Facebook, LinkedIn, social media. And these elements are now being used to make maps as well, or to link up knowledge with spatial data. And all this will then change life as we know it in terms of social, economic security, and environmental change. I won't go into the middle box. I'm now going to go into the box over here. Oops. So essentially, what can we do from a spatial perspective, from a geos perspective, in terms of governance? Can we map? Can we use big data? Can we use e-governance? And I guess I would argue that water governance basically needs a mapping of the resource. So we want to know where is the green water, where is the blue water, gray water, atmospheric rivers. For those of you who don't know, green water is the water that's in the topsoil, and that provides you the bulk of the food that we have in agricultural systems. Blue water is surface water or groundwater. Gray water is a wastewater. And I have a map of an atmospheric river, which I will show you in a minute. Perhaps you want to also map laws, principles, instruments, ownership rights, control, use, changes in landscapes, pipes of water flows, who is hoarding the water, because when you allow privatization, people will also hoard water. How is water being traded between countries? How is virtual water being traded? Who bears the risks of floods, droughts, saltwater intrusion? How can you monitor? How can you enforce? How complaints are made? Who pays bills? How much? And so on. So there are a whole lot of ideas that we could perhaps use mapping processes to help us address. This is relatively uncontroversial in some ways. This is a map made by NASA, which shows you atmospheric rivers. So this is not a real river, it's in the atmosphere, and it shows you where possibly rainfalls may happen, cyclones may occur. So this is something that I think could perhaps be fairly non-controversial, except in terms of who owns the data. Here is another map where we are looking at transboundary river basins and country boundaries. And what I would like to draw your attention to is that country boundaries don't always match basins. So let's take the case of India and China. You have a river basin over here. If you were to apply, say, the European Water Framework Directive approach, which tries to govern water by basins, and so you're going to say, okay, then the basin area is determining how India and China should share the water. It's not going to work in those countries because their governments have to make sure that people across the country can get access to the water. So you have to think of something more clever to try and figure out how the drier areas in India and how the drier areas over here in China are going to make use of this water. And especially in the context of climate change, which probably is going to affect both countries in terms of having much less water once the Himalayas are much more, have melted a little bit. Here's another map we have of the evolution of groundwater law. And here what we're trying to show is that as it gets darker, that's the latest period of groundwater law emerging in different parts of the world. And then we try to link this with international treaties. So do treaties at the international level make a difference to countries' groundwater law, not the actual quality of the groundwater? This is also somewhat one kind of use of this information. This is another sort of information that we can put in maps. This is about legal systems in Africa. So for example, you have in the colors over here different types of African legal systems. So African traditional, Islamic derivation, Islamic influence. On this side, these letters denote the country that colonized Africa, the African countries. And what you find is that in different parts, the combination of these colors and the letters show you what sort of legal system operates in that country with respect to water. So it's not as if you can just walk into Madagascar and say, okay, we are going to redecide who gets what. There's a whole layers of information in these countries as to who owns the water, who has access rights, and who doesn't. And here you have a map which tries to show how European aquifers and groundwater bodies, as they are defined in the law, are then mapped. So we're not mapping the real water, we are mapping the legal terms as they are defined into the water. So for example, the yellow bits are defined as groundwater body under the law. Now this is where the map gets really messy and problematic. Over here we try to combine groundwater law in terms of, does it focus on environmental issues, does it focus on water issues, or does it focus on more general issues, where water is focusing now on quantity issues or sharing issues. And what you ultimately find is you get a very messy storyline. You get Canada, for example, focusing a little bit more on the sharing issues to some extent, but less on, more on the environmental issues than on the sharing issues. And that relates to the fact that in Canada, perhaps drought management is quite poorly organized. But somehow India and Australia look like they're doing pretty well, which is not necessarily the case. So you can't just mix a lot of information in two maps because you can't always understand what they're saying and how to interpret them. Yeah, 5 minutes, okay. Here's another map which talks about global water agreements. So the countries that are party to a global water agreement have got diagonal lines. So there are two types of agreements and they both have different diagonals. And then you have countries with water stress, groundwater stress. And as you can see, Australia, India, and America have strong groundwater stress, and none of them have joined the international agreements on water, which is quite an interesting story, because you obviously see that these three countries may even take sovereignty as the starting point or hegemonic control as the starting point, and that's why they don't want to join international treaties, because then they have to start sharing with Mexico or Pakistan, or Australia has to do something that it doesn't want to do. Here is another case where we're not entirely sure if the maps are useful or not. Again, you have Australia, India, and America, which are countries with groundwater stress. But then we are also looking at, do they use environmental principles in their national law? And India scores very well compared to the US and Australia because it has lots of principles. But still it has stress. So obviously they're not implementing it. So there is some kind of a problem. But I think the maps are just supporting. They're not leading in an analysis. They help to communicate something, but it's not always so clear. I think I want to pick up on something that Vanessa was hinting at when she was talking about how architectural companies worldwide are trying to move into Africa in the last frontier of urban design. And here you can see land grabbing, and with land sometimes you're grabbing water. And you can see over here the amount of grabbed land in different parts of the world. So the size of the circle shows you how much of land is being grabbed in Africa, in Latin America, in Australia, but also in Russia. And then the little red triangles show you who's grabbing. And here you can see the land grabbers, and you can see it's not just the usual suspects of the United States and China, but it's also India, United Arab Emirates, which is buying land in other parts of the world, and of course the UK. So what you're seeing is that this shortage of land, this shortage of water is leading to large-scale purchases across the world by people who don't have that much land or water, such as United Arab Emirates, but it could also be from big countries. And this is where you have the neoliberal capitalist perspective trying to gain monopoly control over these resources which actually need to be shared. Another storyline with respect to water is virtual water trade. This does not fully give you a picture, but what you basically find is that although the Netherlands is extremely proud of its water policy, in fact, we are importing a lot of water in everything that we buy. So a cup of coffee outside imports 140 liters of water with all the caveats that he had brought in front, which is that maybe the data isn't that great. But anyway, 140 liters of water. And what we also find is that countries that are water poor are exporting more water than countries that are water rich in very strange ways. So you can see net virtual water export is shown in green. So the dark green shows the countries that are exporting a lot, and the countries importing a lot are shown in red. So you can see that Netherlands imports a lot of water, Japan imports a lot of water, USA exports a lot of water, Australia exports a lot of water, and these are countries that have a water problem. So it gives you some ideas about the virtual water trade in these issues. This diagram shows you how dams affect rivers and river flows and river ecosystems. So it's also quite an interesting storyline. You could also use maps to show how rivers enter into cities and where they are being purified. So this is showing the purification. You can also show a reservoir, which is this area. So you can also map how water is used by cities, and in fact, where the cities are actually living off the water of the villages around. Of course, maps, when they're made by machines, don't always have ground truthing. So this is where we are doing in Ghana, ground truthing of the forest areas and the houses and the water supplies to the storyline. Another part of the story, of course, is that we're using data from internet users, telephone users, and surveys to collect information to map it. And this itself can be quite problematic when half the world doesn't have access to internet or has access to telephone but not at a good velocity. And the latest experiment that has used an e-governance approach has been the SDG process. So they have gone to all these countries and they've asked people to either write letters when they didn't have internet connection, or send a tweet, or go onto the website on their LinkedIn page or Facebook page to give comments to the SDG community about how to revise the SDGs. And there you see that it's a very interesting pattern of who uses a telephone, who uses paper, but almost all of them are educated and they had some amount of resources. So you're getting also big areas of people will never be covered. And this brings me to my last two sheets. First, if you're talking about information technology and geospatial technology, from a constructive purpose, yes, you can use spatial information, you can layer it, you can combine it with governance data, you can combine ground truthing with remote sensing. You could use big data for combining payment streams with water use information. You could use e-governance systems for spatial organizations of complaints, suggestions, billing systems. You could find out how much people are paying for their toilet use, especially the poorest people, because they often have to go to machines to enter. You could, but you could look at this more critically, and then you could say, what is the quality of the data we are putting into each map? Second, are we putting too many layers, and are those layers connected, poorly connected, irrelevant to each other? Are we making spurious relationships? Sometimes representing data spatially may not make sense. Most of the time, the data that we are seeing is not followed up by ground truthing. It appears that this can be very fast, 2.5 hours, and you can cut a whole city. But to get ground truthing of the material you've done may take much more time, although this is on ground. The big data and e-governance leaves out technologically unconnected people. It is also static, does not take into account of historic processes. And now I come to what I think actually is a bigger problem, which is the governance of this techno space or info space. Who owns this information? I think we were talking about the cloud earlier. The cloud is governed by US law. So anything that a Dutch person or anybody here or in Kenya puts into the cloud falls under US law and US security regulations. We can do nothing in Europe to protect ourselves from that. Privatization of information. The satellites in Europe provide free information, but I know a lot of companies that are converting this free information into expensive apps for use by farmers in Africa. And I'm not sure whether that was entirely the purpose of this whole process. The legal regulation of this entire process, the Internet of Things, Internet, that's really messy, and you are seeing a lot of violation of privacy and human rights in all these efforts. In this particular program, we saw the cars of people. So suppose you were having an affair, your car is in the wrong place, it would be noted by somebody else. I mean, just to give you an example of how your privacy is being violated. Research ethics, when you are doing ground truthing and interviewing people under the EU research rules, you're not allowed to keep data for a very long time. People have a right to be forgotten. We have to destroy old interviews. But we can't keep their data. So how do we connect this? Who can model this information? Big data can only be done by huge computers. Who can use that information? Is the interpretation appropriate? Is it being supported by other evidence? So there are a lot of issues which are critical about how maps can be used, but also about how to govern this information. So I conclude. Of course, resource governance and water governance can use modern technologies to gather better spatial information so that we can improve our outputs, our outcomes, and our impacts. We can look at who owns the stuff, who trades in it, who's monitoring in it. And perhaps we can benefit from good quality mapping, maybe big data, maybe e-governance. But there are many caveats about how the governance of such mapping, big data, and e-governance can be improved.
Thank you very much.